A very good afternoon, all. Welcome to the Department of Social Policies Green Team panel discussion on harnessing renewable wind energy amidst the energy crisis. We'll be in conversation with MP Alan Brown at the House of Commons, UK Parliament, and Professor Ian Gough, who's a research fellow at the Centre for the Analysis of Social Exclusion at the London School of Economics. It will be chaired by Dr. Ganga, also a professor at LSE. A bit about the Social Policy Green Team. It consists of students in the Department of Social Policy who work closely together with staff and faculty across the department to create, initiate, and lead green theme projects throughout the year. We were also recognized for our work in LSE's Celebration of Sustainability Awards at the annual event last month. We won a Green Impact Sustainability Heroes Award to bring about positive environmental impact from organizing events on climate change themes and promoting sustainable action amongst fellow students. This is our third panel discussion where we have a member of parliament. He's the SNP spokesperson for energy and climate change. And Dr. Ian works at the Grantham Institute of Climate Change. Now I'll hand it over to the chair, Dr. Ganga, who will just steer the discussion.
Hi everyone, good afternoon and welcome to this event. It's my great pleasure to chair this session. Thank you so much, Simran, for inviting me. So this is, I think, a very timely event, given various events around the world, but also other issues which are more domestic, such as the cost of living crisis and the implication and the importance of energy for people's everyday lives and well-being, essentially. So it's a really timely and important topic. Please feel free to use the chat. The event will be recorded and closed captioning is also available. First, just a bit of an overview about the seminar structure. First, we'll be having two speakers, Ian and Alan, who will be introducing different aspects of the energy crisis in the UK, as well as the challenges in policy perspective. We'll then transition towards a more solutions-oriented approach and have a discussion about what potential solutions could be and whether they're feasible to really implement and really what are the barriers to achieving them. We'll open up to ask all speakers questions related to the topic. You can send in your questions anytime throughout the chat and it will be voted upwards so I can read them out to our panelists. So please do upvote the questions which you find interesting and compelling too. When you're asking a question, please do give your name and affiliation. So I'm going to first introduce MP Alan Brown. It's actually wonderful to have you here because often politicians are the first ones to actually get things past the post in a sense. So MP Alan Brown is currently the Scottish National Party spokesperson for energy and climate change and also sits on the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee and Nuclear Energy Financing Bill Committee. Before being elected in 2015, he was employed as a civil engineer and attended Glasgow University, graduating with an honours in civil engineering. He's also worked in the water sector for 21 years, both in the public as well as the private sector. So really lots of experience with different types of utilities in different sectors. And now really the chance to actually make an impact. As academics, we often think, okay, but ultimately it's also the politicians who take the decisions while we do all the research. So over to you, Alan, and thanks very much for coming today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for having me on. Although it's interesting to say politicians make all the decisions, I think sometimes the problem is politicians don't make enough decisions or don't make them quick enough. What I intend to do is I'll talk about energy policy kind in general, but also renewable energy in general, rather than just focus on wind. And I'm trying not to be too intimidated, being sandwiched between two professors, so I'll give it my best shot. So kind of as per the opening remarks, why do we want to grasp renewable energy and develop renewable energy? We know there's a climate change emergency. We see what's happening around the world. And funnily enough, Ganga, you'd mentioned my previous employment. So in a past role, I worked as a civil engineer. It was sewer flooding I dealt with. And actually over the years, I could see the impact of more and more severe rainstorms causing flooding. And it's an issue that needs addressed. So we know climate change is happening. we know we're running out of time to actually get on track to limit global warming to the 1.5 degrees increase that was agreed at Paris. So we really do need to do stuff. So it's welcome there for the UK government to set a net zero target of 2050. I would point out the Scottish government's leading the way with a 2045 net zero target. Also, in terms of the need for developing renewable energy at the moment, we know the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Russian control of their oil and gas exports has caused this huge gas price surge. So there's a reality that here in the UK, we've got people that can't afford to heat their homes. Now, I spoke in a fuel poverty debate this time last year, and I quoted an estimate from National Energy Action, a charitable lobby organisation, and they estimated that there's 10,000 premature deaths a year from people that are living in fuel poverty and therefore living in cold, damp houses. So that's a scandal in a developed country. Now, when I use that figure, the energy cap last year was £1,100 per year, so that's what the average household bill was. It's now doubled to just under £2,000 a year, and the latest projections for the October increase in the price cap is going to be over £3,000. So household energy bills will have trebled in just a year and a half. So if we already had people living in fuel poverty and dying prematurely before, then it's a real crisis that needs addressed. And while the Chancellor, or the previous Chancellor, did announce some welcome measures, if you look at it, the government's providing a £400 rebate on our our electricity bills. That doesn't come anywhere close to offsetting the massive increase in household bills that people are having to deal with. It's also estimated that actually fuel poverty and the health effects, it's got an impact on the NHS, something like £2 billion a year. So if we actually get our energy policy right and have people living in homes that they can properly heat and are well insulated, it's got health benefits and savings to the NHS. And looking ahead to net zero, there's 28 million homes in the UK that are still reliant on fossil fuel for heating. 24 million of these use methane gas, and obviously they're subject to the current volatile pricing. We've also got 4 million households that are off the gas grid, and they're actually struggling even more with the energy price spikes, because they have to fill up their oil or gas tanks and paying massive sums of money in one go when the tanker comes. So you're talking about maybe £1,500 to £2,000 for them to fill up a fuel tank, and they're not protected by the cap, so they don't have the same support that people that are on the gas grid do. So that is a kind of almost depressing scene setter. It shows that now is the time to embrace renewable energy. Going forward, it would mean no reliance on imported oil and gas. It's going to mean a transition away from energy generation that emits greenhouse gases. And if we do this properly, we can actually create a just transition, meaning cheaper energy for people and new jobs being created in the green energy sector. I must admit, I tend not to be too complimentary about UK government policies in general. It comes with being an opposition politician, but it was great that the UK government did put a net zero target of 2050 into law. But I would caution that they're already not, at the moment, they're not on track to meet that 2050 target. They're supposed to set carbon budgets and meet these carbon budgets that will get interim targets, and they're not meeting the current carbon budgets. They were actually set based on old targets before we adopted net zero. So the government really does need to step up in policy and long-term planning if we're going to hit net zero by 2050. So it means having more joined up coherent policies. And so that for me means what the government should be doing, and what it should be doing is trying to anticipate what will net zero mean in 2050, what levels of electricity generation are going to be required, how will that electricity be generated. That allows you to work backwards, and that allows you to start planning for how the electricity grid is going to need upgraded and plan for that in advance. Because at the moment, the electricity grid upgrades, it's done in small chunks or small cycles. So the current investment period is only for the period 2023 to 2028. The grid operators aren't allowed to do what's called anticipatory investment, i.e. they're not allowed to build in extra allowance for possible future expansion or actually allow for where they think renewable energy might be generated. It's all based on where consent's already been granted. So this actually means if there's not better long-term planning, we'll do some grid upgrades in the next few years, but then we'll need to be further grid upgrades because other renewable generators won't be able to connect the grid because there's not the capacity there. So it really needs this long-term approach. The government has said they'll start to allow anticipated investment, but they really need to agree this with Ofgem and get that framework up and running. Now, again, in terms of setting targets, the UK government is very good at setting targets, and that's good in itself, but you need the policies to back that up. But that said, they've now got a new target of 50 gigawatts of offshore wind generation by 2030, so that is very welcome. But again, I repeat, that's where you've got to start planning the grid upgrades to be able to facilitate this 50 gigawatts of offshore wind. And I've pointed out to the Secretary of State for Bees last week when he was in front of the Bees Committee that in Scotland, the Crown Estates has just finished a round of leasing of the seabeds to companies that want to develop offshore wind or floating offshore wind. They've sold leases for 25 gigawatts of offshore development, but National Grid's only allowed for 10 gigawatts of that to hit the grid. So you're already potentially cutting off 15 gigawatts of offshore wind development by not planning for it at this stage. And the government argument is, well, it's competitive auctions. You need some people to lose out to keep the price competitive. But that seems a very short-sighted vision from our point of view. Now, on the positive, offshore wind generation is an area that the UK can argue to have led their way on in terms of how they've developed the competitive auction process, the contracts for difference, which guarantees a set price for electricity generation, where companies are given a contract for 15 years with an agreed strike price. So when this process first started, offshore wind prices were something like £150 per megawatt hour for offshore wind. The auction results just released last week. It's got offshore wind now down at £37 per megawatt hour. So that means over the years, offshore wind generation has went from being subsidised by the strike rate process to actually not only now being subsidy free, but actually at the moment is delivering electricity below the wholesale electricity market. So it can actually be argued to be actually, it's really beneficial for customers and should be able to bring prices down in the long run. And also another advantage of the auction process and making the auctions more regular is it provides a steady work stream and full order books for companies. So they've actually now been able to invest in manufacturing facilities. Siemens has got a blade factory in Newcastle. Offshore turbine manufacturing has been set up in Teesside. There's another facility being constructed in the Port of Nigg in the Comity Firth in the north of Scotland. So that's great. That's actually creating the green jobs that we're looking for. But also there's other constraints that's going to go with this success story as we try to grow offshore wind further. And that skills and labour shortages is going to be critical. And that's where the government policy of ending free movement in the EU, it shows you how bad a policy that is, because it actually allows the engineering sector to be easily supported that way. Also, it's hoped people will move from the oil and gas sector, but if you look at government policy at the moment, they're talking about increasing oil and gas exploration for the North Sea. So therefore, workers are actually going to be retained in the oil and gas sector longer than otherwise might have been. But also in terms of oil and gas sector, it's got an ageing workforce, so some of them might actually choose to retire rather than move into the renewable sector, which was kind of hoped for as part of that transition. So really we do need a long-term skills and labour plan just to ensure that doesn't stall progress in the development of the industry. Another massive issue from a Scottish perspective is a grid charging regime. Scotland's got 25% of Europe's offshore wind potential, but yet generators in Scotland pay the highest grid charges in the whole of Europe. It's illogical. The grid charging system is created from formulas that were set up when the electricity market was privatised in 1990. And the system back then, the concept was all about new large power stations such as coal, gas or nuclear. So it was set up to incentivise construction of these power stations closest to large areas of population, which by default means closer to London, the better. So 30 years later, we've now got a completely different energy system, one that's still evolving to renewable energy, but we've got a grid charging regime that actually punishes developers for constructing the best locations off the coast of Scotland. Now, to illustrate this, I spoke to an offshore wind farm developer last week, and he confirmed he's going to be paying 40 times more per unit of electricity to connect to the grid than a comparator in the south of England. Now, if we look at this in a different set of numbers, what it means is a 1 gigawatt offshore wind farm off the North Scottish coast is going to pay £38 million a year to connect to the grid. The same size offshore wind farm connecting to southern England, the grid in southern England, will actually get paid £7 million a year. So that's a £45 million a year differential between the Scottish and English offshore wind farms. And over 20 years, that's nearly £1 billion differential. So that makes it hard for these developers to compete. It's unfair and it's causing real uncertainty. Now, some people argue that these charges reflect the fact you've got to move the electricity about, and so it's moved from Scotland to England. But how can you possibly be paying a developer to connect to the grid in England? Because you can't have a negative cost of operating and moving the electricity about. So it's just completely illogical. It should be overturned. I tried to bring in a private member's bill in the last Parliament to actually review the grid charging, but not surprisingly, the UK government blocked it, unfortunately. Now, if we return to another positive, another success story in delivering low-cost energy generation, that's been onshore wind. Now, again, the auction process has been used very well to drive down costs, and that's delivering low-cost energy. One unfortunate spin-off is that the auction process wasn't used to specify local content, so didn't build up a manufacturing base and lost out in building up better UK supply chains over the years, but it still does deliver low-cost energy. But again, in terms of consistent energy policy, a few years ago, David Cameron actually blocked onshore wind from competing in the auction. So that's actually cost 6 years of onshore wind development, which is not only short-sighted, it damaged the industry for a long time. So it shows you need to have consistent policy, don't miss out. And just as an aside, onshore wind was initially developed, onshore wind turbine prototypes were initially developed in Scotland some decades ago, but the government of the day chose not to back that. Whereas if you look at Denmark, the Danish government embraced onshore wind and the development of it and the manufacturing. That's why Denmark's got a really strong base in onshore wind and massive export opportunities, and they supply many of the turbines that we use in the UK. In terms of grasping opportunities, in terms of renewable energy, there's massive opportunities in emerging technologies. Tidal stream. There's a MyGen project in the Pentland Firth in the north of Scotland, which is the largest tidal stream prototype in the world. It's still small capacity compared to other types of energy generation, but this can provide stable, predictable energy generation. It could, as expanded costs will come down, and actually could provide massive exporting opportunities around the world. One of the companies in Scotland is already developing off the coast of Canada, and they've noticed a much bigger difference between the attitude of the Canadian government versus the UK government, where the Canadian government's really trying to drive it forward. But the flip side of that, in a good way, was in the last auction there was some ring-fence monies for marine energy. So there'll be further tidal stream energy generation, but we need much greater levels of support so that industry can scale up and develop the manufacturing opportunities that go with that. The same goes for floating offshore wind. Again, the biggest prototype in the world's off the coast of Scotland. It's another industry that can expand. The government's now got a 5 gigawatt deployment target by 2030. So we're hoping to see good things in this sector as well going forward. And green hydrogen is another aspect that we need to be investing in. Green hydrogen actually complements renewable energy very well, because you can create hydrogen using surplus energy when there's less demand for energy, but you can still harness the wind energy to create the green hydrogen. That hydrogen could also be used for conversion, say, coming off fossil fuels in the transport sector, such as HEVs, trains, boats, etc. So there's possible fantastic opportunities there. And one other energy policy aspect I would say that's quite topical just now is nuclear. So the UK government and Labour both argue that nuclear is needed. They say nuclear is needed for baseload, nuclear is needed for reliability. I would argue that's false. National Grid chairman years ago said baseload's an outdated concept. If you look at Hinkley Point C, the nuclear power station being built just now, it's nearly 50% over budget. It's years late. So nuclear is not a short-term fix either. And the UK government's own impact assessment, the cost for financing a new nuclear power station, including the actual upfront capital cost and the long-term financing of that, is estimated to be £63 billion. So for me, we could do so much more with that level of expenditure in terms of renewable energy and investing in energy efficiency, which energy efficiency obviously makes homes more comfortable to live in, but it reduces electricity demand. So that's a win-win. And one other aspect about nuclear and its so-called reliability, in a 10-year period, I looked at this, and each nuclear reactor on average is offline nearly 20% of the year over a 10-year period. So nuclear isn't always there when you want it to be either. And it's also either an on or an off concept. So it doesn't complement renewable energy well at all. And one technology that does complement intermittent renewables is pumped storage hydro. So there's two schemes in Scotland where developers are ready to go with pumped storage hydro, but the UK government's not providing a route to market. So that's quite frustrating. Again, it shows this lack of joined up energy thinking. And I realise after saying I wouldn't talk too long, I've probably talked way longer than anticipated. So I will bring my remarks to a close. Hopefully that gives a flavour of different considerations in terms of the energy sector. Going forward, there's fantastic opportunities. In 2020, Scotland actually generated the equivalent of 98% of its electricity consumption demand from renewable generation. So that shows how it can be done. And I look forward to the UK government and the UK getting on the path to net zero and hopefully making a difference, I say, have a just transition, and let's deliver fairer, cheaper energy for all.
Amazing, Alan. Thank you so much. I have so many notes on the different energy options now, which we love to discuss in the questions after Ian goes. It's great, really a big honor to also introduce Ian. Professor Ian Gough is a professorial research fellow at the Centre for the Analysis of Social Exclusion, CASE. He's also an emeritus professor in social policy at the University of Bath. His current research project is supported by the ESRC and is on the intersection of climate change mitigation policy and social policy at the LSE. I must say that one of my PhD students is very interested in sufficiency and needs-based work as well, which Ian's worked on a lot. Over to you, Ian.
Thanks. Thanks very much. That's a bit out of date, actually. I'm now working on sufficiency, and it's funded by the Leverhulme Foundation. But anyway, thanks for the invite, and congratulations on achieving on the achievements of the LSE Social Policy Green Team. I wish I could get my stuff. Oh, I've got it here. Okay, and thanks to Alan for that. I learned a lot from that his introduction, and that's all very useful, especially about the costing and competitive contracting and so forth. I want to situate what he said in a sense and go beyond it. Because yes, obviously we need stacks more wind energy and numerous other new energy technologies. We must end fossil energy very soon. Net zero by 2050 is now an official commitment, and it's one spreading it across the world. That's one of the achievements of the Glasgow COP last year. This is net zero, of course, taking into account absorption of carbon and greenhouse gases. And it's also true, of course, that this will have co-benefits regarding human well-being. for example, air pollution. In fact, wind, as Alan's shown, is a relative success story for the UK, despite some backward movements at present, and despite some less than optimal government policies. But it is, on the whole, one of our success stories. But it isn't enough. And I want to say what more is required if we're to meet net zero by 2050. So I want to make just 4 points. So the first is that energy and electricity are only part of the problem. We need massive improvements, especially in what I'll call the big three necessities, which is transport, homes, and food. These are three very big areas, and they're very high carbon areas. And the Climate Change Committee, I think Alan mentioned, emphasizes these and has chapters on each of these, and is very critical of the UK progress so far. I mean, take buildings, for example, which account for 20% of our domestic emissions. The UK housing stock is very, very inefficient, one of the most inefficient in Europe in terms of heat retention and energy efficiency. But all the policies since 2010 have been failures. I think that the Climate Change Committee talks about a stunning failure on both new building and retrofitting. On retrofitting, there was a successful warm homes program way back, but that was quickly scrapped, and all the plans since then have failed. The Green Deal was a failure, for example, and led to a crash in loft insulation. Loft insulation was going very well. After the introduction of that program, it collapsed. And on new build, I mean, what are we actually building for new homes? We now have the Build Back Better Green Homes grant, but that has also collapsed and seems to have disappeared from view. So the paradox is that most of the new homes being built now will need rebuilding very soon in order to meet the net zero targets. We're not anywhere near it. And of course, new homes are a tiny proportion. The bulk of homes are existing and they will require retrofitting. So that's one big area. And I haven't talked about transport and food here either, which goes beyond energy. We need as much energy and renewable energy as possible, but we need more than that. Secondly, is the issue of consumption. It's not often realized that the emissions per head that we talk about and in all the negotiations are of territorial emissions. They're emissions from particular countries. But you can also calculate the emissions embodied in the consumption of the populations of different countries. And that gives you a very, very different figure. The UK consumption emissions per head are about 50% higher than the emissions from UK territory. Why is that? Globalization and deindustrialization have led to the export of emissions from the global north, if you like, to the global south, especially to China and rapidly industrializing countries. So our consumption-based emissions are a lot higher, and these also have to be tackled. The recent IPCC report now recognizes the importance of what it calls demand-side policies. So apart from all the technological and supply-side policies, that will not be enough to get us down to net zero. And they talk about the importance of demand-side policies. And they have this model of improve, shift, and avoid, which has been developed in the transport sector. So improvement in transport means investing in electric cars, essentially electrifying the fleet. But that's not enough. You then need to shift modes of transport towards more public transport and walking and cycling and active travel. And then even that's not enough because you need to avoid some mobility altogether. you need to actually avoid a highly mobile society. Not hugely, but that will also make a difference. So this is the now recognized in the IPCC report. But when you look at what's happening on the ground, it's the complete opposite. It's SUVs, these heavy, large cars. Sales of SUVs are soaring. And the International Energy Authority actually calculated over the last decade what were the largest contributors to global carbon dioxide emissions. First of all, the energy industry, of course, but secondly was SUVs, the huge growth of SUVs across the world. This is the rebound factor coming with a vengeance. You improve the efficiency of car engines and people buy larger cars. And this is a major issue on a world scale. The World Bank actually said that if the 40 million SUVs in the United States would change for ordinary cars, all the people in the world could have electricity without more emissions, could have a modest amount of electricity. That's the trade-off, if you like. So consumption policies, demand-side policies are also going to be required, difficult though they may be. The third topic I want to raise is inequality. And there's a lot of talk about averages all the time. And there's a distinction between means and medians, which we could go into when we're talking about household burdens. But the main paradox here is that the income and wealth are the biggest drivers of emissions. We know that, both between countries and within countries, between income groups, the rich, the upper middle class, the poor. But on the other hand, the other part of the paradox is the big three necessities are all high carbon, given the present system of provisioning. That is housing, food, and basic transport. So rises in these costs hurt the poorest families most. And the recent energy costs rises that Alan spoke about following from the war in Ukraine are a real crisis for the lower half of households. Energy costs account for about 10%. I haven't got the figures with me. I do have them, of low-income households, but around 2 to 3% of high-income households. So any whack up of energy costs is immediately redistributive in a regressive way. So people really are facing, and since food costs are going up now, we've got heat or eat, or neither. And at the same time, prices discourage the affluent far less. They can put up with these sorts of prices, so inequality will increase. So we do need to address issues of inequality and well-being at the same time as environmental and renewable issues. So fourthly, I mean, this is the only solution to this, it seems to me, is a combination of a Green New Deal and a social guarantee. The Green New Deal involves substantial social regulation, legally imposed limits on environmental impacts. Well, the Climate Change Committee is trying to do that with its 5-yearly budget. And it means upfront investment, not after the event. So this requires a large-scale state, industrial and financial policy. I can't see any alternative to this. It means investing in the foundational economy, the sort of the economy we all depend on every morning when we get up, and the essential work, which was identified at the start of the lockdown. I was very intrigued by the way governments across the northern world identified a set of essential jobs which had to be maintained. So you need that, but also you need, I argue, a social guarantee because of this pressure on the cost of essentials and necessities. So we need a social guarantee to develop green transport, less meat eating, warm homes, but also in child and adult care and so on. So this leads on, I can hear people asking the question, how is this all going to be financed? Much of this, the answer is that much of this is investment. It's not consumption, it's investment in a sustainable future. And thus it needs to be financed by borrowing and quantitative easing, QE. You can harness private investment where possible, and there's a lot of that which can be done, especially in energy, but it will require a bigger state. And this is happening. This is the paradox. I mean, Biden's American Rescue Plan, which has gone through, is talking about spending 1.9 trillion US dollars on some of these issues. The EU Green Deal plan, which has gone through, is proposing spending 1 trillion euros on this. So I think actually we're seeing the end of austerity neoliberal politics, but perhaps it will be continued here. Will the UK be an outlier here compared with other countries? So my conclusion is that you can't separate out energy and environment from well-being and inequality. These two, the social and the environmental, have to go together. We need eco-social policies which link the two. Because if the drive to net zero is imposed on all income groups in society, then lower income households will be forced below the poverty line. It has to be, the basic burden has to be on the consumption of upper income groups. And that's one of the points I made in my book, Heat, Greed and Human Need, which was the main thing I've been working on recently. I say the class dimension of consumption and ecological responsibility, what must be tackled simultaneously with environmental issues, or a grave injustice will be perpetrated in the name of saving the planet. If you don't deal with the injustice issues, you'll get a backlash, a popular backlash, which will prevent much needed policies that we all support happening. I'll stop there.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ian. I think that was really great to see two different perspectives, both on the policy space, both in terms of the nitty-gritties of the policies and things like the auctioning and competition, but also from the perspective of actually societally, how can we transform these systems, right? And really also think about the people who are directly affected by them. So I think if it's okay with you both, I might kick off with a question to you both and then take one. We've also got a few in the chat. So I guess I'm a behavioral scientist, so I'm looking at how potentially people can really change their behaviors on the ground and help aid this transition. And Ian, this sort of fits in with the demand side management issues you were talking about, as well as, Ellen, like you had mentioned things like insulation or installing like a pump storage, all of these have to be, individuals, households availing of these grants, availing of these schemes and opting into them, right? So there's definitely this individual level action needed to help support and facilitate this sort of more structural systemic change that we need. What in your views are the biggest barriers to changing these behaviors at the individual level, or what can the state do, or what policies should we be adopting to change these behaviors? And if we really want to broaden that up, we can think not just of energy efficiency behaviors, which is a very small slice of the pie, but really things like what are the sorts of policies that people should be demanding from their politicians, right? How can we actually get, what are the sorts of things which in your view are most effective? Should they be arguing for insulation, for instance, or heat pumps, or should they be arguing for a ban on fossil fuel licenses, which a lot of social movements have put recently on the agenda? So what are these sorts of individual actions which are most important and policies which they should be demanding to both of you?
Do you want me to go first?
Sure.
Yeah, of course, there are behavioral changes happening. Some people are walking more and eating less meat and so forth, and wearing sweaters indoors and all the rest of it. that's very important, but it does require the infrastructural changes which you mentioned. You just can't, if there. For many towns in England, outside London, which has wonderful public transport, where I now live, you have to have a car in order to get to work and to get to healthcare and to get to schools and all the rest of it. So it's really pointless talking about major changes in behaviour without tackling the lack of alternative forms of transport, just to take that one example. I remember being at a debate at the LSE 3 years ago on this, and it was a sociologist and me and a psychologist, and we all said the ability of individual behavioural change to make a big difference is limited. It has to be backed up by these sorts of policies. And what I suggested, one of my priorities would be, there would be Green New Deal type policies, which as well as covering energy, would cover, I think, the big three: housing, we've talked about that a bit, transport, and also food, and the nature and distribution of food. Could talk about that some more. But coupled, I would say, with a greater emphasis on basic services, rather than compensating people with money to provide the essential needs of life. So that would mean more public transport, better and locally provided home insulation and so forth, and direct provision in kind rather than compensation in cash. I think that's important. That offers security and is much more sustainable too. There's plenty of evidence that publicly provided services are more energy emissions efficient than private services.
Fantastic, thank you, Alan. Thank you, Ian. Alan.
It's kind of difficult for me to say what people should be demanding of politicians, because in theory I should already be doing that. But I agree with what Ian was saying there about investment in energy efficiency. Now, this is where I maybe should highlight that the Scottish Government actually spends 4 times more on a per capita basis on energy efficiency than UK Government does. And when I speak to energy companies and charities that support people, in terms of home energy, they all call for the UK Government to spend more money directly on this. In actual fact, when you look at the UK Government's got a target that all homes will be upgraded to what's called DPC Band C in terms of energy efficiency. So to get to Band C by 2030, but they're not even halfway there yet. And they've got a massive exemption that says where reasonable, practical and cost effective. So the other week I asked the Secretary of State, what does that exemption mean? How do you actually define that? And his answer to me was, well, you should know, Mr. Brown, you can tell me. So when the Government Secretary of State can't tell you what effectively is a loophole in the legislation means, then it means the government's not going to be able to enforce that policy. So definitely need to up their game on energy efficiency. In terms of people engaging with politicians, and if we're talking about behaviour change, there's a brutal reality that the people that are the poorest and struggling the most are the ones that are least likely to engage with politicians or policy, except for looking for help in their day-to-day matters. So they're less, I don't want to over-stereotype, but there's a reality. If you're struggling in your day-to-day living, you're not looking to net zero in 2050 and demanding policies from politicians to meet that. You're looking for ways to support you so you can afford to eat, you can afford to heat your home, but less likely to look at that in a bigger policy measure. Now, in terms of policies, for me as well, one aspect, if we're talking about fairness, I spoke about how successful the energy auctions have been. Now, they have been successful in driving down costs and delivering much lower cost renewable energy. But the way the contracts for different auctions work is that money is paid for through our electricity bills. So it's effectively a green levy on our electricity bills. So clearly by default, that's more regressive, because if you're struggling to pay to heat your home, or to pay to keep the energy going, then that chunk of money affects you much more. And if it was an income tax basis because it came from general taxation, then clearly that's much fairer and equitable, because those that can afford to pay more will contribute more to that change. So that's one big aspect I think really needs to change, as moving environmental levies off of our bills and moving it into general taxation. One more thing maybe about energy efficiency. I think the government needs to start looking at doing area by area, street by street rollouts, because that's how you drive down costs as well. If you've got contractors can move into an area, they set up their site compound, they bring in their materials, and then they actually base themselves there for say 6 months or however long it takes to do that. Because at the moment it's all very ad hoc. So even measures that are paid for through what it's called ECO, which is again paid through our energy bills, that's very much done on an individual customer basis. So therefore you're not getting the work efficiencies of doing it at scale in an area. Contractors are going from one area to another to deliver that on an individual basis. So I think that needs to be reviewed as well, to get effectively more bang for your buck as you roll out that policy. I think I'll leave it there unless there's anything you want to press me on.
Can I just come back on that? I mean, that sort of rollout happened with the switch to North Sea gas, didn't it? And that was pretty effective. That's the sort of thing which is required. Alan, you say that the government needs to up its game on retrofitting. I mean, there is no game. I mean, there's virtually nothing happening on this. And the Climate Change Committee is scathing on this. It talks about a catalogue of failures. So it's good to hear that Scotland's doing better, but we're not doing well at all. Here's a possible solution to deal with this terrible, harmful rise in energy costs, which is happening now, and going to worsen in the next year. That is some form of social tariff, where the first X units of a household gas and electricity come at a low price or even free, and then there's a tapering tariff which rises. This would protect the incomes of low-income households and would put more of the burden on higher income households, which is much more luxury consumption of electricity, or second homeowners, and so on and so forth. That would be my that's one idea. I see Polly Toynbee advocated that recently. I think there's something in that.
Yeah, on that, I think it's also linked to the idea that the polluter should pay. So if you look at where emissions largely come from, it's the top 1% in terms of asset owners and income groups, actually, which sort of adds up to this question I think Patricia has put in the chat, who's an LSE student from Mexico, around the carbon tax. So the idea that we should start having tariffs and price incentives and things quite differently. So not just investments in infrastructure, but also changing the market. So her question is, carbon tax has traditionally been set low and increased gradually over time. However, a new model has been proposed where the initial carbon price is high and increases for a particular time and then decreases. And the rationale is to incorporate the value of avoiding unknown climate risks. I mean, if I could add to that, also, we know that, for some, in particular, one criticism of things like financial instruments like offsets is you buy the license to pollute if the price is too low, right? So I think it fits in with that idea. The logic has been said to treat pollution with a financial economics approach. What do you both think about that?
I suppose I can go first this time. I mean, I'm happy with the principle of a carbon tax set as per your remarks earlier, Ganga, in terms of polluter pays. That should be the basic principle of the carbon tax. What we need to make sure is, some people talk about a carbon border tax or a border tax adjustment. We do need to make sure that if you're implementing higher levels of carbon tax, that you make sure you're not then just offshoring emissions to other countries. So you need to make sure goods coming in pay a carbon tax levy, so that's not done cheaper and undermining the whole principle of polluter pays. And also, I suppose it depends your definition of a carbon tax. So if you look at oil and gas exploration, they do pay much higher taxes. And obviously yesterday there was legislation went through Parliament in terms of the excess profits levy, because the oil and gas companies were making extra money just by virtue of the spike in gas prices. So certainly I supported that as well. In terms of viewing carbon taxes, an issue that I find crazy is if you look at aviation gasoline, there's no duty paid in aviation gasoline. Now we know international travel causes a lot of pollution. So why are they doing that with no carbon tax? It makes no sense. And you're actually at the moment there's industry trying to develop sustainable aviation fuels, but because gasoline's duty free for aviation, there's no incentive for airlines to switch the source of fuel they're using. So a fair carbon tax there would actually, if you're talking changing behaviour of companies, that would quickly drive the market for sustainable aviation fuel, bringing down emissions. So there's quite a lot to debate on carbon tax, but I agree wholeheartedly with the concept that it needs to be high enough to bring about change, and sometimes it's that change by encouraging other products that's actually the real winner at the end of the day.
Well, I think I disagree with that. Well, I mean, I don't disagree with the idea of a carbon tax, but it's never happened. And the carbon tax would have to be really colossal, $200. I mean, a lot of money. Carbon taxes, the economists speak about a global carbon tax always, but that's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. And so you're then into the issue of border tax adjustments, which Alan mentioned. That would be necessary if we went for a high carbon tax. But the main problem with carbon tax is that it's always regressive, always, unless you have a whole stack of measures to prevent that because of the high carbon content, as I said, of the necessities of life. And that's why I think there's an alternative model of the Green New Deal, which is deliberately to tackle, and demand management, deliberately to tackle the key elements of life that we rely on, and to deal with them separately with specific policies which link that to social issues, to fairness. I can't see any way of making a carbon tax fair. The only way that's been suggested in America by Hansen is a carbon tax and dividend, but I don't think that's will be the right answer. Just giving a little bit of cash to lots of people will not achieve the fair carbon efficiency which we want to see.
Okay, fantastic. So this actually is a really good segue to Ruth Massey's question, who's from Leiden University. And his question, or their question is, how can politicians untangle the causes of energy crisis and inflation for its understandably confused citizens, especially as it pertains to household, consumer, and lifestyle pressures, in the sense of for people's everyday lives, right? And I think this is an interesting one, because we've been talking about the role of investments and sort of future-proofing our economies and our lives, but also potentially things like the market. But another way to address this issue is by things through actually having good civil courts and legislations and addressing fairness head-on. So the idea that actually we also have a civic society to address this. So I'm taking Rush's question a bit further than it initially sort of poses, but the idea that actually one way that people can sort of tackle this is also by holding companies to account for, say, negligence. You had mentioned things like Shell and fossil fuel companies are coming under lots of litigation recently for things like greenwashing. So how can lifestyles and consumers actually use those facilities, apart from things like changing the market and changing their behaviors at home and actually looking for different sorts of infrastructure? What about civic society more broadly as it comes to courts and legislations? Maybe Ian for you, and then maybe we could jump to Ellen.
Okay. Well, the inflation one is I mean, that's a very contemporary issue, which I might leave to Alan. But I've tried to answer that by saying that there is no alternative but to running increased public investment financed by borrowing and quantitative easing. I mean, we've just got to start getting out of this notion that all government spending is consumption and not wasteful. On litigation, yeah, there's a lot. Well, I think in climate change, we need everything to happen. So litigation is useful. I don't know. We haven't seen any big results from it yet, but it's certainly growing. And there's a group at the LSE, isn't there? I think that are mapping worldwide. Are you involved in that?
No, a colleague is though. So they're mapping sort of environmental litigation cases.
Okay. Yeah.
Across the world. Yeah.
Well, be interested to see what that comes up with. No, my approach would be that local collective initiatives. There's limited amount what individuals can do here, but at the local level, we can have cities action. And I'm quite impressed by the numbers of cities that are setting up climate change assemblies at city level in Scotland and in England. And that has led to considerable agreement, sort of consensus on some ways forward. Whether that can transmit into local political action is another matter, especially since local authorities are so constrained in the UK. I mean, they have very little autonomy. But that to me is a bright light at the moment.
Amazing.
If I pick up on what Ian said there about government investment and not view borrowing as bad and not view tax as bad, I would say I share that viewpoint, Ian, and I'm actually concerned at the debate at the moment because here in the UK you've got people running obviously to be Prime Minister, leader of the Conservative Party, and they're talking about tax cuts and we need to cut taxes. So that is going to impact on. It means you're not creating a fairer society because tax cuts are designed to benefit those that are already the wealthiest, so they certainly benefit most. And unfortunately, it seems to me the Labour opposition down at Westminster, even yesterday, they were talking about how the UK has got the highest tax burden, and they're effectively goading the Conservatives to cut taxes. So I've spoke before in the chamber and argued, and I know Labour's defensive because they respond to the fact the Conservatives say they're the high tax party, so they're very aware of that. But for me, they need to be arguing about fairer taxation. You can't just use a blanket, a tax rise as a bad thing. A tax rise can be a good thing if it's raised fairly. It's not regressive on people in lower incomes, and then you reinvest in that. It's quite clear there's. Well, sorry, I'm going to digress slightly. So in Scotland, we've got the debate ongoing whether Scotland should be an independent country or not. So the Scottish Government published a consultation document the other week. It was called Why Not Scotland? And it looked at small independent European countries and a range of measures, particularly poverty measures. And the UK was the worst performer in all the categories. So these smaller European countries that are making their own decisions and creating fairer societies are basically performing much better. So that shows how a different approach in government can actually create that fairer society. So that's a kind of wider argument that we're looking at in Scotland as well. And apologies if I digressed there, but I suppose it's to show. So some of these other countries do have higher tax. They do have a higher tax base, but they're using that to create investment, create a more equal society. So great investment in public transport, as Ian had mentioned, is a requirement. Just generally supporting people better. So it's about driving up the incomes of the less well off, and reducing that inequality is key, and that's what government policy should be driving at.
I agree. The current debates amongst people who want to be Prime Minister is incredibly depressing. There's just no recognition that if they take net zero seriously, if they take their own COP26 seriously, requires a lot of government investment and so on. And also I think that central bank goals, the goals of central banks should be expanded to include sustainability goals, as Mark Carney wanted, but that seems to be going backwards at the moment. I'd stress again, I think that there's still a difference in the US, strangely enough, and in the EU. Would be different probably if Biden loses, so that there are alternative models, if you like, out there, and we don't have to follow this race to the neoliberal bottom like is happening in Britain.
I'm going to apologize. Unfortunately, the fire alarm has gone off in my building, and it's not a drill because it's not stopping. So I'm unfortunately, I think I must leave the building. I was hoping it was a drill, but it isn't. But Simran, I'm very sorry, but maybe it's okay. I think there were a couple of other questions which we should go through. It's been lovely to talk to you both. I wish I could stay for a bit longer, but I really have to go. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. So we have the next question, I think, but Alan wanted to say something.
Just one more thing in terms of moving away from neoliberal and government borrowing. So that's actually, again, Scotland, the Scottish government get very limited borrowing powers, and it's something that the Scottish government's actually asked for, is to have wider range in borrowing powers so that they can actually, start to invest in a green type recovery at the moment. But the constraints imposed by Westminster actually make it very difficult to do that.
So the next question is for Professor Ian. Could you talk about the particular challenges of the recent record heat waves on the ability to secure the big three that you mentioned, food, homes, and transport? For example, South Asia is expected to face disproportionately higher supply side challenges such as energy costs for cooling, adapting farming, and food security. This is by Rush Massey from Leiden University, Netherlands.
Oh, how interesting. Well, I think the answer is I can't say much on this. It's a huge area that I don't know much about. So, clearly, right, step back. The heating, the global heating which is taking place, brings about the need for more air conditioning. That is rising fast, that's true. And the need for air conditioning and present provisioning systems will increase carbon emissions, which will increase the global heating. So there's a vicious circle here. There's a vicious circle too, potentially in food. I'm not an expert on how to restructure agricultural policy in Britain, let alone in Indonesia or wherever. That will depend on local circumstances. But you can see that the dangers there, but there is also a clear route out of that, argued by Monbiot and other people. I guess perhaps the easiest there is, or the easiest is transport, where with the improved shift avoid model, you can envisage some shifts in destructive transport, except that, as I say, the whole shift of society is not in that direction. We have a consumer-based, market-based, advertising-based economy, which is seeking more and more growth. And that's powerful headwinds against dealing effectively with global warming. That's not a very good answer to the question, I'm sorry.
So the next question is from Patricia from Mexico. The question is to both of you, is a new economic model required to address these issues in a sustainable way?
Yes, yeah, and we're working on it. There are interesting models around which move away from the sort of old style theory of value, which argues that market valuation can't really be questioned. And so if a hedge fund manager earns 1,000 times more than a care worker, that's what he's worth. There's a lot of debate going on about the notion of a sufficiency economics, where the goal is sufficiency, if you like, rather than efficiency. In practical terms, one important shift here, I think, one important development is the idea of foundational economy. The economy which we all use, as I said, in the mornings when we get up, we put the power on, we put the kettle on, we go by public transport to whatever we're doing. That whole foundational economy accounts for about half of the economy in Western societies. If you include all the services and electricity and water and transport and health and food distribution and so forth, it's about a half. And I think the estimate of the numbers of essential workers during the lockdown was about 40% of the population. I'm trying to get these figures together. So I think we need to start thinking of the economy in sectors or domains rather than just the economy, and emphasizing the foundational economy. Then there's the normal market economy, hospitality, coffee bars, whatever, no problem with any of that. Then there's the luxury economy at the top. And I think there we need to hit that pretty hard. So I think some sort of three sector model of the economy is emerging, which is new and which could be helpful.
I wouldn't disagree with much of what Ian said there. I mean, that in your opening remarks there about pay inequality, certainly it's a structural issue in the UK that really does need addressed. But if you're looking at, you mentioned essential workers, but if you look at the debate at the moment, while inflation's going to hit 10 or 11%, where's pay restraint being imposed? It's been imposed on these essential workers. While
yes, that's right.
The government's taken away the restraints that were put in bankers' bonuses, so that shows that inequality and that difference in attitude is still there. But even I was just thinking there, we've got the energy retail sector has failed in the UK. So with 30 energy companies or whatever going bust, that's another failed market that needs addressed. But we've got Bulb Energy, who was the biggest energy company to get into administration. They're still in administration, but the chap that set up Bulb Energy and the chief financial officer, he's still getting paid £250,000 a year to the chief financial officer while Bulb's in administration, and us as bill payers are paying for the losses that Bulb Energy is continuing to accrue. It looks like it's going to cost at least £2 billion. So why wouldn't you step in and at least do some form of pay restraint, for this failed financial officer? It kind of defies logic to me. But again, it shows that kind of blinkered, well, the market does what the market wants. So I agree with Ian that we do need a change in thinking in terms of that neoliberal market policies.
We need a new economic model. We do.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last question for both the speakers is from Shreya. She's an LSE student from India. The question is, does the foundations of economy needs to be altered in order to make the policy sustainable in the long run, both for developed and developing countries, like supporting the general public with essential need items rather than cash transfers? Would this require specific economic policy changes? What do you think? Over to either one of you who wants to start first.
All right, you go first in that one.
Well, that follows on directly from what I've been saying, really. I mean, I think that's an addendum to that. But there is a group of us who are arguing for this notion of a social guarantee, some floor below which people shouldn't sink, which would be partly in cash, which depends partly on fair wages and then partly on decent social security system. But it also depends on services in kind. We're arguing there for universal basic services as a general feature of, as the questionnaire said, moving away from cash to in-kind benefits. That's what I think we need to see. And we're arguing that this, I mean, it's clearly necessary in the whole care sector for a kickoff. I mean, it's just a mess at the moment and involves lots of negotiation by people who are in desperate need. But we're talking about, for example, low or free bus fares as a way of providing extension of mobility for low-income households. And also fair rents, well, I could elaborate, but I think yes, the general model I think should be that for the essentials we need to move towards some more direct provision where useful. I'm not talking about nationalising supermarkets or anything, but as a buttress, and then more regulation of luxuries and top incomes.
Again, I'm pretty much in agreement with Ian on that, and I didn't mean to say in your earlier comments, the last question, completely agree in terms of proper luxury goods should be taxed much higher because, again, people with a disposable income can pay that bit more tax. It's not going to prevent them buying these luxury goods. I suppose one thought in terms of developing countries, again, it's encouraging governments of developing countries not to follow the neoliberal and not to follow that, allowing people to develop wealth disproportionate to other citizens in the country. Also, I think it means where overseas aid is given to developing countries, it should be done with that view of long-term sustainability and actually helping, to grow the economy, but to grow it in a fair way and get people on a sustainable pathway. I suppose that also brings me to something I was thinking about in terms of wider climate change, and that's where we need to look at loss and damage and actually support the countries that are most affected by climate change, which of course climate change in terms of greenhouse gas emissions has came from the developed countries. So there should be loss and damage funds set up to actually support these developing countries and mitigate against that as well.
Yeah, that's been blocked so far, of course, and but I guess debt relief is also important, and that perhaps there's a chance of some movements on that front.
Thank you, both of you. And the chair had to unfortunately leave. She would have given the closing remarks, but we will be sharing the video on the LSE Social Policy Department website, the LSE website, and the Green Team. And it was wonderful having such questions raised. And we will be sharing the post-event with all the attendees and in our groups. Most of them are having exams or dissertation, but I think the questions raised have been really pertinent and timely. So we hope to gather more responses like post-event, like with the recording once Maria shares it. So, and I'll update the chair on the last few questions. Thank you so much for attending.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and good to listen to you, Alan. Yeah.
My pleasure. Pleasure hearing yourself, Ian. So I'll think on some of the suggestions you had.
Perhaps we should stay in touch. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.